Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson. This week on the show, we're kicking things off by examining the first Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Janet Gaynor was the big winner for her performances in Sunrise, Seventh Heaven, and Street Angel. But why did she beat fellow nominees Louise Dresser and Gloria Swanson? We'll explore all this and more on today's episode of And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome to a brand new era of And the Runner-Up Is. I'm so thrilled to be back with a whole new series focusing on Best Actress at the Oscars, figuring out why the winners won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of each and every Best Actress race. We're going to be going through them one by one in chronological order, starting today with the first Academy Awards. For those of you who are longtime listeners of the show, I'm sure that you've gotten used to the format that I had originally had, where I made a decision on who the runner-up was of the Best Picture race ahead of time, and we discussed it and we reviewed it for the first segment of the show, and then went on to talk about the Oscars and some of the other films nominated. But we're switching things up with this series, and I will get to more of that in a little bit, but I have to introduce my very first guest for this Best Actress series. When I was thinking about who I wanted to have on the premiere episode, this guy was right towards the top. You've heard him countless times on this show talking about actually a lot of different eras of film, including this one. And I'm so pleased to welcome him back from his great blog, The Awards Connection. He's also a writer for AwardsWatch. Please welcome back Andrew Carden.
Hey, Kevin. How's it going?
It's good. We're in a whole new era.
We have discussed some Best Actress contenders as well. The great Cher, the wonderful Ingrid Bergman.
That's true.
Perhaps others that I'm not thinking about, but at least those two. I mean, Cher is one of the all-time greats. So
indeed. Cannot wait for that episode in particular. So I'm very, very excited to have you on for this first episode, and I will just get into a little bit of the format for how we're going to do this. How it's going to work with this series is that instead of focusing on one predetermined runner-up like I did with Best Picture, we will discuss all of the losing nominees in this first section and sort of going into as much detail as we want, talking about the performances, talking about the movies that they were nominated for. We'll probably delve into the lives of the actresses and their reputations at that point when they were nominated. And then we will talk about the winner and discussing the performance, the film, etc. And then having a discussion about the dynamics of the Best Actress race for this year, talking about why, in this case, Janet Gaynor won, why Louise Dresser and Gloria Swanson lost, whether there are any notable snubs, and then at the very end, we will be giving our verdict on who we think was the Best Actress runner-up. So I am so excited about this. Andrew, are you excited?
I am beyond excited.
Yes.
I'm so honored to be the first guest on what I'm sure is going to be like my new favorite podcast.
Yes, it's And the Runner-Up Is 2.0.
Yes.
So before we jump in, I did have a few questions for you, Andrew, to let people sort of know more about you. My first question for you is, who is your favorite Best Actress winner of all time?
So that would be the magnificent Shirley Booth of Comeback Little Sheba, who I think is just an absolute powerhouse. And I wish that more folks would see it. I know it's very obscure, but Shirley Booth, who is really more known as a sitcom star, she just tears it up. She is incredible. And, in terms of other Best Actress winners who, I think are all-timers, I love Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs, Liz Taylor, who's afraid of Virginia Woolf. Barbara Streisand and Funny Girl, all phenomenal. But for me, Shirley Booth is just the best of the best. It's a performance that I wish more folks would see. It is definitely an obscure one, but I think a brilliant one. And I wish that she had, more leading roles like that.
I agree. I remember watching it for the first time for this show back in Best Picture. Not that I had to, but I wanted to watch her performance because she won Best Actress, and I was really, really blown away. It's not a performance I really had heard much about before outside of you and your great top 100 greatest Oscar-nominated performances ranking. I remember you had her very high, so she lived up to expectations for me. And my other question for you was, what was your most heartbreaking loss of all time in Best Actress at the Oscars?
Oh, that's kind of an interesting question, because I think that Jenna Rollins in A Woman Under the Influence is my favorite Best Actress nomination, but she lost to another great performance, Ellen Burstyn in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. So I'm not really heartbroken about that. I think that the real heartbreaker for me is 1988. Which is Glenn Close and Sigourney Weaver both losing to Jodie Foster, because I really don't think Jodie's that great in The Accused, and she would of course win 3 years later, so she's already going to get another Oscar, and it leaves both Glenn Close and Sigourney Weaver Oscarless. And I'm not sure either of them's going to end up winning a competitive Oscar. Fingers crossed.
How dare you?
I know. But, for me, that's the real heartbreaker, because that's just such a clear opportunity to give it to one of them. And they're both brilliant. I loved Glenn in Dangerous Liaison. She's a powerhouse. And I think Sigourney's doing some really phenomenal work, and Gorillas in the Mist as well. So if there's a heartbreaking situation for me that really kind of pisses me off, it's that one.
I agree. I very much agree. As a Glenn Close stan, that would have been a great opportunity for Glenn, and I agree. Sigourney Weaver, she doesn't really get talked about as having lost compared to how much people talk about Glenn losing that, but I agree that would have been great, and it would have been great if she won for Working Girl. It's the same year, double heartbreaking loss.
I know. I mean, if you have Glenn and Sigourney both winning, I mean, gosh, then we'd all just be
solved
focused
so many
on
things.
We'd just be focused on getting Michelle Pfeiffer and not betting their Oscars.
Yes, which is what God intended.
Yes.
All right. So I think we should jump right in.
Let's do it.
So the nominees for Best Actress at the very first Academy Awards were Louise Dresser for A Ship Comes In, Janet Gaynor for Seventh Heaven, Street Angel, and Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. That's 3 movies. And Gloria Swanson for Sadie Thompson. Let's just start off by addressing any overall thoughts that we have on this lineup in general before we dig into these performances individually. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this as our very first Best Actress lineup?
Well, it's interesting because these are such different performances, not necessarily among Gaynors. She gives a fairly similar performance in all 3 of them. Not to say it's a bad performance, but it's very, tonally similar. But Gaynor versus Dresser versus Swanson, these are 3 very different acting styles. I think that they each have extremely different screen presences. I think that all of them are actually very interesting and appealing. It's interesting watching these 3 really flex their acting muscles. I think you can tell that perhaps some have a bit more stage experience than screen experience, and are perhaps a little bit more comfortable in front of the camera or not so much. While I wouldn't rank any of these among, the all-time great nominees by any stretch, I think they're all pretty fascinating turns, and they were, plenty watchable for me. I was nervous that, these would kind of be a slog to get through. And there were moments where I was, checking my watch a little bit here and there. But I did find myself drawn in to different extents by all of these performances. So this was kind of a pleasant surprise for me, because I thought that, at least one of these would really underwhelm. And while I think one of these films is a tad underwhelming, the performance in it, I think, is quite interesting. So I think this will be interesting to talk about.
Yes. So had you just seen the Janet Gaynor performances before this?
So I had seen Sunrise and I'd seen Seventh Heaven
Okay.
previously. I hadn't seen Street Angel. I thought that Street Angel, for some reason, I did this whole project years ago where I tried to basically fill all the holes in performances that I hadn't seen that were Oscar nominated. And when I did that, I had thought for some reason that Street Angel was just completely unavailable. I'm really glad that I was able to see it.
Yeah.
But I hadn't seen that, and I hadn't seen A Ship Comes In, which is nearly a lost film.
Yeah.
So, we had to go to certain lengths to obtain the full copy of that. So
We did.
I had seen Sadie Thompson as
Okay.
well, so I just hadn't seen the one Gaynor nominee and Dresser's film.
Gotcha. Yeah. So for those who have been listening, I went backwards with my Best Picture series, which means I finished off with this very year that we're talking about. And I very recently, as in earlier this year, had watched all of Janet Gaynor's performances here and talked about them on that show. And I had not seen Louise Dresser or Gloria Swanson. So those were first time watches for me. And I actually agree in terms of the differences in these three actresses' styles. And also, what I found interesting is that I feel like we're already seeing archetypes of what the Academy really likes in Best Actress, where, we have the ingenue, I think is clearly in the case of Janet Gaynor, a real discovery moment. You have Gloria Swanson, who is much more established and is playing this darker themed character. And then you have Louise Dresser, who's kind of in like the mom role, or kind of like the suffering wife, however you want to really see the film. And these are all archetypes that I think have followed through a lot of Oscar history. Suffering wife has kind of trended more towards supporting actress in this case, but I don't know. I just think that's interesting that right from the beginning we see these very distinct themes of the Best Actress nominees.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah. And so Janet Gaynor won for her three performances. So first we will be discussing Louise Dresser and Gloria Swanson. Let's start off this whole Best Actress series by discussing a performance that I would wager few people in modern times have even heard of, let alone seen, and that is Louise Dresser in A Ship Comes In. Yes. So, just a little background on Louise Dresser. There's actually not a whole lot that's been written about her, especially compared to Janet Gaynor and Gloria Swanson, but she had a vaudeville act and she was a Broadway performer. She made her film debut in 1922, and she would be in a film with Rudolph Valentino where she played Catherine the Great. And then a few years later, here she is in A Ship Comes In. Probably best known for being in State Fair alongside Will Rogers a few years after this. But yeah, otherwise, there's really not a whole lot of background on her. I don't know if you found anything else noteworthy on her.
No, I have to admit, like prior to this, I kind of thought that Louise Dresser and Marie Dressler were the same person, which they're certainly not. Marie Dressler's like a queen.
Yes.
But yeah, I really didn't know. I had known that she was in State Fair, but she isn't somebody who I'd turn on TCM and be like, oh, there's Louise Dresser. To me, she's really not a recognizable face
Right.
at all.
Right. Well, let's talk about her.
Yeah.
In A Ship Comes In, she plays Mama Plesnik, who is the matriarch of a European family that is immigrating to the United States. And this is, I think, a few years before World War I. Yeah, it has to be. And we see how the family tries to adjust to their new circumstances, but mostly the film is about Mama Plesnik's husband, Peter, who gets a job as a janitor, and he calls it being the big push broomer at the embassy, where he is eventually made into a citizen. But then on the same day, there is a plot to kill the judge, and he actually ends up being framed by this local criminal to make it seem like Peter was the one who wanted to kill the judge, even though it would have made no sense for him to have that motive, but that's fine. So the bomb goes off in the judge's office, and Peter is sent to prison, and he's found guilty. And then meanwhile, we have their eldest son, Eric, joining the war effort. So that's the other plot line of the film. So where does that leave Louise Dresser? I would say mostly in a reactive role, where she kind of has to bear the brunt of all of the turmoil that's going on with her family. I think just in general, this is a supporting performance. We do not have supporting categories until 1936. So what do you think? Do you think this is a lead, supporting? What's the nature of this role?
I think she's right on the fence.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where, she would land. It kind of reminds me kind of Death of a Salesman, and that role. Linda Lohman, I believe, is the character's name. Mm-hmm. The suffering wife, of course. I think the long-suffering wife role tends to so often be kind of a borderline lead supporting. Yeah. And I think that's very much the case here. And I think it's interesting. I think that this isn't a very good film, but I do think that it's an interesting watch, because I think that Dresser and Schuldekraut, who portrays the husband, are turning in very different acting styles. He's very boisterous, kind of over the top, very colorful, a lot of movement. And she's very, understated and kind of holds everything back. But you can still see, a lot in her face. I think it's actually pretty impressive. She's not giving the sort of flashy performance that somebody like Gloria Swanson gives in Sadie Thompson. Not to say that Swanson's bad or anything, but these are just such different performances tonally. Just the look on Louise Dresser's face, throughout a lot of her responses, her response to her son's death, the look of shock on her face when her husband returns from prison, and then when she has to reveal to her husband, that her son has passed. I think she's turning in really nuanced work here. It's a performance that would probably feel kind of silent, even in a sound picture. I'm not sure that in a sound picture, this role would have a whole lot of dialogue. She's somebody who's, sort of blending in with the background, fading into the wallpaper. But I think that kind of works with this character who's just kind of watching everything around her. And I wouldn't say this is an extraordinary performance. I think that there's a lot of scenes where it's a rather thankless role, but she does leave an impression for me. And I think that her reaction to her son's death rings a lot truer than Schuldekraut's. And I think that final shot of Schuldekraut saluting his son's portrait just rings so false. Yeah. I think this film almost kind of plays like U.S. propaganda at a lot of points, just like pro-U.S. propaganda. I think a really interesting version of this film would be kind of a middle finger to the notions of the American dream. A story in which this family comes to America and, their son is killed in war. The husband is locked up, framed for something. And the mother just is distraught and either, just leaves the United States or lives out her time, just totally distraught. Instead, this kind of has a happy ending that doesn't ring true at all. And I think the film ultimately is kind of poorly directed. I think the score is pretty dreadful. It's just kind of like shitty takes on old American classics. And I think it's pretty forgettable outside of its performances, but I do think that Louise Dresser is doing some interesting, subtle, understated work here. And I prefer what she's doing over Rudolf Schuldekraut, who, too, is, I think, pretty memorable, but giving the sort of over-the-top theatrical performance that's a lot more common in these silent pictures. I think it's pretty rare that we see a performance that's this understated, this quiet in a silent picture. And I think for that, I do have to give Dresser some credit.
Interesting. Well, I have a very different take on this.
Yeah.
Honestly, because I see what you're saying in the idea that she's understated, but almost to a fault for me. I do think she does have a largely thankless role for a lot of it, that she does elevate the scenes that she is in. I will give her that. It's just not really enough for me to truly understand this nomination. And it was even written about at the time that it was a surprise of a nomination because the film wasn't a big hit and she wasn't the most popular person necessarily in Hollywood. So that's basically where I'm at. I mean, we can talk about the end of the film, which you mentioned is, I think, probably her most effective scene for sure, where she has to go through all the wild emotions of seeing her husband come home after being exonerated, which, by the way, I don't understand exactly how all that happened so fast. Where
it's so absurd.
The judge comes down and is like,
film,
okay, you're free to go, and also
yeah.
you're free to go today, and also your wife doesn't know about it yet until he comes home.
This is an absurd film, and I think that a lot of the cards are, I mean, like Mama fixing her clothes like a queen, like give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is just almost plays like self-parody.
Yeah.
And then there's like the wartime recipes for patriotic housewives thing.
Yes.
Which is just
so absurd, made with no sugar for patriotism, I suppose.
I know. But, you know, I kind of like this performance. And there's also a scene where the husband tells Mama that, you know, she should laugh more often and be happy. Mm-hmm. And so she gives this kind of forced laugh. But the way she does it is, you know, simultaneously very sad and kind of scary. I think she really hits a lot of the right notes in this. I just think that she's working with a director who doesn't know how to utilize her. And I think had she had a better filmmaker, a better script, that she really could have thrived. As it is, I think she's just doing like a lot of heavy lifting in a film where everything around her is just so mediocre.
Yeah, maybe that is the issue. The ending, just this whirlwind where, you know, she's happy and maybe a little bit confused to see her husband back home, and then, you know, having to break the news to him that their son died in the war, and she goes back to being very upset, and the film does kind of just leave her there in that emotion, which I found interesting. Also, as her husband is like cartoonishly saluting the picture of their son and feeling very patriotic. And watching this, you know, I'm just like, how is his wife really feeling about all this in this moment? You know, is she feeling that sense of America is the greatest place on earth, where like her husband was charged with a crime that he didn't commit and found guilty and spent time in prison, and then her son joined the war effort and got killed? I want to know how she feels about America. And I do think that we see some of that in her face, but I think it is a major fault of the film that we don't get much of her perspective on it. Like, yeah, we certainly see her being quite sad and just mournful about the situation, as any normal human being would be, but the film ends on this note, I think, that just is like, you know what, we're going to carry on, we're going to persevere, America's still great, that sense of pride, and that just goes completely against the reality of how this woman would be feeling. And I get that we have to look at this with perspective, with films being a little simpler at this time, with the patriotism being in the air, the war was over, and maybe they can't get away with too much negativity about America, as you were saying earlier. But I just feel like it does a disservice to her character by just sort of having her accept all this horrific stuff that's come her way, where she's also been introduced as this strong matriarch of the family, and then to leave her in this really weak place by the end is just very unsatisfying. And if I'm being honest, I don't think the film is really interested in telling her story to begin with and making her like a fully fleshed out human being. And I do think that she is bringing a lot to the table herself in trying to make a person out of this two-dimensional thing that's been written for her. So I do give her credit for that, but it's just not really enough for me to have any real reaction to it. Like, honestly, I wasn't really moved by that much of her performance, even as she was trying to give those emotions. Like some of the scenes, like, you know, in the courtroom where her husband is there and she's begging that they find him innocent and is very like over the top and sort of wailing in that moment. I'm still not really moved by it, and I think it's all probably a fault of the direction at the end of the day. So
yeah, I think the better version of this would be that the husband, you know, he exits the film on, his typically, boisterous, positive note. He leaves the room, and then we're left just with the mother and just like a close up on her face and of her
Yes.
unhappiness. That would
Yes.
be so fascinating. And I think that's what Dresser's trying to get across, but the director just isn't on the same page. So she just ends up instead in the background giving this great performance. And I do think she has a lot of great moments in this. It's just, man, she's in a not great film.
Yeah.
And I wish that she had more roles on this level, with better directors or bigger studios moving forward, because I think she could have really torn it up. And, she just didn't. I think she got mostly supporting roles, and it is what it is. But, I think it's an inspired nomination. I love when understated turns like this that, aren't showy at all make the cut. And for me, at least, she does leave an impression, even if everything around her is so underwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, the easy comparison that I can look at with this kind of performance is Jane Darwell in The Grapes of Wrath, in terms of just this sort of matron kind of a role that is still able to evoke so many emotions just in her face. I think, she seemed to be capable of that. If she was in a better film, maybe she could have won maybe a supporting Oscar, and if she got the chances,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, this is no Grapes of Wrath.
right. Unfortunately. Yeah. Would have been interesting to see Louise Dresser in that role. I don't know how different that would be, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, nobody could ever top Jane Darwell.
No,
I mean, I think she's the greatest supporting actress winner ever. So.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, another thing that I wanted to do as I go forward with this series is to just talk about some reviews and some sort of clippings of when these movies and performances came out, and just give context of what people were saying at that time. There's, again, not a lot going on for A Ship Comes In. Wasn't a popular film, but I did find a review from the New York Times from Mordaunt Hall, who said, Miss Dresser gives an earnest portrayal as the mother, but her actions, due to the direction, are far too slow.
I mean, I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah. It's just very interesting that even at this time, there was that feeling that, like, yes, she's giving it her best effort, but the direction is not helping her in any way.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much right on the money. I don't think I've ever seen another picture from William K. Howard.
Right.
So, I'm not, maybe perhaps he did some phenomenal films on, otherwise. I don't think he did. But, this is not indicative of a brilliant filmmaker who knows how to work with actors at all.
No. So that is Louise Dresser. Did you have any other thoughts on her before we move on?
No, I think it's noteworthy that, one of the screenwriters on this, Sonia Levian, went on to a very remarkable career, actually, and wrote in Old Chicago and Oklahoma, and she actually won a screenwriting Oscar for Interrupted Melody, which is an Eleanor Parker vehicle that you'll be discussing later in the podcast. So that's noteworthy, but otherwise I don't think there's a whole lot else worth discussing about this one.
Yeah, I would agree. All right. So let us move on to our other losing nominee of the year. And that is a very different performance, as we were alluding to. Gloria Swanson in Sadie Thompson. So Gloria Swanson, a whole lot has been written about her, so there's no need to really stretch too much to find a lot of info on Gloria Swanson. She was a very big star by the time this even came out. In 1925, she joined United Artists at a time when she was actually considered the most bankable star of the era, and she used her influence to also become a producer on a lot of her films. She created Gloria Swanson Productions, which Sadie Thompson is one of the films that she produced herself for herself. And the story is an adaptation of a play called Rain, which was on Broadway with Gene Eagles, who we will be talking about next week, by the way. And it was essentially banned from being made into a film, but they sort of made a verbal agreement with Will Hayes of the Hays Code. And he apparently said that there wouldn't be a problem producing the film. Eventually they secured the rights, but they went back and forth a lot with producers and the powers that be, just about the more morally questionable aspects of the film, because it gets into some dicey territory. So she is playing the titular role of Sadie Thompson, who is kind of a party girl, and it's heavily implied that she is a prostitute. She hails from San Francisco, and she comes to the island of Pago Pago, where she is going to a shipping line elsewhere, so she ends up staying in a hotel and partying it up with the local Marines, and she ends up meeting a guy named Timothy O'Hara, played by Raoul Walsh, who also directed and produced the film. They start to fall in love, but then they are forced to deal with a Christian zealot who is described as a moralist, Mr. Davidson, played by Lionel Barrymore, and he very much disapproves of Sadie Thompson and her ways and tries to get her deported back to San Francisco unless she reforms herself and converts to Christianity. So naturally, conflict ensues. Yes, I will go first on this one. So this is one of my favorite silent film performances that I can recall seeing. She does so much with the material to the point that nobody else could play it like her. And she just has this really intoxicating charm that is really compelling to watch, especially compared to, Louise Dresser or the three Janet Gaynor performances we'll get to. She's fully in command from her introduction all the way to the end of this film. For me, this is a very pure movie star kind of performance, and spoiler alert for a lot of this series, but I'm a big sucker for big movie star performances that get nominated for Oscars. So what were your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much on the same page. I think that no one in the silence quite had the look that Swanson had. She's just so magnetic in this, and she's playful, and she's sexy, and just her entrance onto the island with all the men swooning over her. I mean, it's so dazzling. And I think she has a lot of Mae West energy here. She's so
Yes.
irresistibly flirty. And I think she especially shines in the opening half hour where things are a little bit lighter. She just puts her hair back. Men are just all over her. They're marching in to clean up her room. She's sporting that ST badge, Sadie Thompson. Mm-hmm. And I think that the rapport she has with Raoul Walsh is really warm and fun and flirty. I love their cigarette kiss. I think that's just so iconic. Yes. She has a lot of great lines. She has, you're a peach to worry about me, to Raoul Walsh. But then, for me, while I love Swanson in this film from start to finish, for me, the film takes a little bit of a turn downward once it focuses in on the Lionel Barrymore stuff. Mm-hmm. Because I think that Lionel Barrymore is honestly kind of terrible in this, personally at least. I think that he so overplays it to the point where it almost starts to become kind of campy. Mm-hmm. And I think the back and forth between he and Swanson is entertaining on some level. It's not as satisfying as the rapport that she and Walsh had. A lot of the cards, about how she's an evil woman, how she needs to kneel and repent. It gets so melodramatic. And again, I mean, it's plenty watchable, but what was so magical in the opening of the film, I don't think is quite there as it progresses. And I think that it becomes increasingly campy. She's so committed to this role, and it's so memorable. But anytime that Barrymore is on the screen in this, and I've liked Barrymore in several films, but I think he's just too intense in this. I think he's doing way too much with his eyes and his eyebrows, and it's just distracting. And, for me, it's a relief whenever he's not on the screen, because I just don't like what he's doing here. Tonally, I wish this film, had that playfulness that it had earlier on. And perhaps I'm just not totally sold on the material of Sadie Thompson / Rain overall. But for me, I just wish that it could be something a little bit on the lighter side. With the focus so much on Barrymore, it kind of loses me a bit.
I would mostly agree with that. I do wonder, though, how much that is something that Lionel Barrymore just naturally was bringing to it, so much as, having to deal with the religious aspect of things. And I do wonder how much it's like him being directed to be a little more cartoonishly villainous, when he is being set up as the very clear villain of this story, even though he is supposed to be preaching morality and Christianity, and yet he is also a big hypocrite and, sort of lusting after her at the same time. It feels like they kind of are tipping their hand too much, that like this guy is bad to the audience.
Yeah. I think that everybody else, in this environment is just so lived in, they really feel like they're characters. And I feel like Lionel Barrymore instead is just like on the stage, screaming to the back of the balcony, give me a Tony, even though the Tonys didn't exist back then, obviously. Yeah. Everything around him is really satisfying. And for me, his performance was just very predictable and, going through the motions in a way that I just didn't like. And I wish that Walsh were in this more. I think Walsh is really terrific and kind of fades as the film progresses a bit. I really liked when he was on the screen. And the other thing is I don't think Sadie's transformation toward the end, where she kind of gives in to Barrymore, is altogether ringing true. I think it's kind of campy too, just her appearance changing so much. Again, I think Swanson's so committed to it that she herself and her performance are completely satisfying. But I don't know, maybe this material just doesn't quite connect with me. I wish that it were tonally everything this film brings to the table in the first half hour. I wish it could continue on moving forward instead of focusing so much on the Barrymore stuff. And I know that the source material is perhaps impossible to play any other way. I just wish perhaps an actor were giving a bit more understated or surprising a performance. For me, Barrymore really isn't bringing any surprises to this. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting looking at these films through the lens of what I'm doing, which is focusing on these actresses that I'm not really as bothered by Lionel Barrymore, even though I agree that he's the weak point of the film. It wasn't something that really distracted me from what Gloria was giving to this performance. Certainly the light just shines on her in this very glamorous way. So you can tell it's a Gloria Swanson production. She's very present. She seems pretty conscious of the other actors she's playing off of, and especially Raoul Walsh, and also allowing us in the audience watching to have that kind of a investment. And I just feel like you can tell that she has studied this material and that she fought tooth and nail for this to be made. And she was really there from the beginning, which I do think contributes to just how effortless she feels here. She just seems very confident in who the character is, at least, again, in the first half, as you were saying. And I feel like you just know that you're in safe hands. Even if some would say that the other elements of the film aren't up to par, it's like she is who you come to see. That is what this film is for me.
Her heart and soul are completely in this. I think perhaps even more so than Norma Desmond many years later. It wouldn't surprise me if Gloria Swanson, looking back over her career, really, looked back on this with even more fondness than something like Sunset Boulevard, because this just feels like the quintessential Gloria Swanson role. And, this isn't boring for a second. A lot of these silents, that they can be a little, bit of a slog to get through at times. There wasn't a moment in Sadie Thompson where I was bored. And, got to credit Gloria for just giving it her all. I just wish she had a slightly more satisfying leading man.
Right. I just love, especially in the first half, where she just has this kind of swagger to her. It's almost like she's just like bouncing when she's walking.
She is incredible.
I just find really fun.
Oh, she's so incredible in the
just
first
the body
half of
language.
This.
Yeah.
Oh, she's so confident and playful and seductive, but very, very approachable too.
Yeah.
All these men. These men are just all over her, and why. If you were around her, you wouldn't be able to resist either.
Yeah.
And, I just wish the whole film could have been like that. And I know that it's not realistic, but for that time, for me, it's pure movie magic. And I will say that this is leaps and bounds better than the remake that Rita Hayworth would do many years later, which is just dreadful. I think it's called Miss Sadie Thompson.
Oh.
And that just makes so many mistakes with this material. But yeah, I mean, Gloria is fabulous.
Yeah. Well, we got a question about that from Twitter that we'll get to a little later on about the other Sadie Thompsons. So, yeah, I mean, even outside of the scenes where she's just like fully confident, there's also some scenes where she gets to be very vulnerable, like when she's talking with Raoul Walsh about like how one of his friends married a prostitute, and there's this feeling that maybe she could sort of go off into the sunset with him and leave all of this behind. And there's a real vulnerability there, but it's not overplayed. And it's like she's really considering what life could be like if she decided to settle down, and she's just figuring out her options. I love those particular moments for her where she gets to not necessarily be that life of the party kind of woman, but really figuring out what kind of life she wants to live long term,
Yeah. I love that scene, and I wish there were more of them with she and Walsh. I mean, Walsh does an incredible job, shooting her. Like, he knows how to shoot her, just so perfectly.
And she knows her angles.
Yeah. I mean, they did a fabulous job, besides casting Barrymore.
Right.
I'll stop with the Barrymore, just because I really like Lionel Barrymore in other films. But I had seen this before, and I didn't recall me having this reaction to his performance previously, so I was just kind of startled by it this time. But I'll stop with that. We should focus on Gloria.
It's fine. It's fine. Well, speaking of, I guess, one of the scenes that they share, I did want to highlight another one for her, which is just the sequence where she realizes that she has to repent, and Mr. Davidson, Lionel Barrymore, basically says, like, the only way to do so would be to spend time in prison. All the way through that sequence of time where she spends the time praying and praying and praying for forgiveness and repentance, I think she is quite compelling in those moments, even though that does take much darker turn compared to what we saw before, into something a little more campy, to use your word. We definitely do see a little more of that flair come out, especially in the moment where she's just screaming at Lionel Barrymore, like, hang me and be damned. It gets to some operatic highs there, or lows, depending on how you look at it. But definitely playing to the rafters in some of those scenes, that even though we can't actually hear her delivery because it's a silent film, I could still hear it. Like, I could still feel it. I could sense how she would deliver that line.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's great even in those scenes, but again, I really think she really shines earlier on in the film.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that opening half hour is just brilliant cinema, and she is front and center and just so fabulous.
Yeah. You almost wonder what the story could have been. I feel like it could have taken so many different turns beyond that point into something that's like a fun murder mystery, or
I know, it makes me wish that she did more, romantic comedies,
right?
Because I really think she would have been a fabulous, she could have done roles like Carol Lombard or like Woman of the Year kind of star vehicles. She would have been so fabulous, and I feel like she, almost came around too early. I think she would have been just so dazzling in some of these star vehicles in the 40s. And it's just tragic that she wasn't able to get work like that.
Yeah.
And she was just absolutely brilliant, and ultimately, I think, underutilized.
Definitely. Yeah. And even in the later scenes where it really gets bogged down in the drama of everything, I do think that even when she comes out and she has like the different hair and it's like all long and wavy now, and she seems softer and a little quieter, I do think she still just has a commanding presence on the screen that is very captivating, but it also feels like the light has gone out of her, and you see the weariness just in how her movements are more sluggish. She's not as animated in her face, but it's not like she's a totally different person. Like I said, she still has that screen presence and just this way of looking at another character with those eyes, those incredible eyes. And you just see that person is still inside of her and it's almost begging to come out, but she's just been so beaten down that it's hard for her to overcome that.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen Frances, but the dynamic between Lionel Barrymore and Gloria Swanson here reeks so much of the dynamic between Kim Stanley and Jessica Lange and Frances. I won't go any further than that, but just somebody who is so committed to sucking the life out of an amazing person.
Wow. I love these cinematic parallels.
I know.
Yes. Well, I will also just add that it's kind of a shame that the last 10 minutes or so of the film has kind of been lost. Mm-hmm. And it had to be sort of recreated, sort of like the 1954 Star is Born, where some of those scenes were lost.
Right.
Just with still images that we see towards the end. I feel like I just would have appreciated seeing how she navigated the conclusion of this film, and we don't really get that outside of some very glamorous pictures.
Right. I mean, it's so jarring when we see his body wash ashore. Just like, whoa, that was quick.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I have to say, the restoration of this is really incredible. Like, the film looks.
Yeah, they did
the
best they can. Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, something like A Ship Comes In isn't going to get the restoration that this does, but. Yeah, I mean, kudos to, I think it was Kino that did this. And wow, I mean, it looks incredible. But it is a shame that, that footage is lost.
Would have really brought her performance home for me. Yeah. But I still think, regardless, the first 90% of the film is proof enough that she damn well earned this nomination. And she, as much as you could say that someone was going for it for a awards group that doesn't exist yet, like, this is it.
For sure.
So just looking at a few reviews that I found from the time, again, going back to the New York Times, Miss Swanson's acting is an outstanding achievement. This production is naturally handicapped when compared to the stage version, owing to the lack of sound and striking colors, and therefore it's the great credit to Miss Swanson to have made her role so absorbing. So, yeah, I mean, very, very glowing reviews. Even some reviews like Variety said that the film wasn't that great, but, her involvement in it just made it worth seeing.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I know that the film was a commercial success, too. So
it was, yeah.
Folks loved her.
Yeah, so any other overall thoughts on Gloria Swanson and Sadie Thompson? You want to get any more digs in on Lionel Barrymore?
No. I'll leave Lionel alone.
Yes, please. Well, I think it's time to get to our big winner, Miss Janet Gaynor, our very first Best Actress winner. So she was mostly an extra and in bit parts before having a supporting role in the Johnston Flood, and she got some attention for that, and she was chosen by the Western Associated Movie Picture Advertisers, which was a group of top Hollywood publicists, and they voted on what they called baby stars, which were young actresses who were thought to be on the brink of movie stardom. And she was chosen by them as one of their baby stars in 1926, alongside people like Joan Crawford. Mm-hmm. So make of that what you will.
That kind of reminds me of, remember the, I don't know if you've seen the Oscar clip when Bob Hope and Lucille Ball introduced like the new stars of cinema in the late 80s, and it was like Ricky Lake and Christian Slater, and then just a ton of people who never did anything else.
Right.
I'm sure that wasn't quite what this was, but that's what first came to mind.
Very similar, and almost similar to what the Golden Globes did for a long time with like, new star of the year.
Pia Zadora.
Yes, exactly.
Janet Gaynor was the Pia Zadora over time.
Well, now we've said it. Moving past that.
Yes.
let's just talk about these three performances. I want to start with Seventh Heaven. And here I really feel like I was saying before, she's just truly the ingenue. She is playing a prostitute who's down on her luck, abused by her sister, and she ends up falling in love with a man named Chico, who cleans the sewers, and he ends up taking her in, basically to protect her from being arrested for being a prostitute. And they develop a relationship, and then he goes off to war, and they're sort of spiritually bound by this mantra that they've created where they always sort of check in on each other at 11 o'clock every morning, even when they're apart. So a big, sweeping, romantic melodrama. I talked about the film as the very final Best Picture series episode back in February, so I'm probably not going to say too much else, not to, repeat myself. But what were your thoughts on Seventh Heaven for Janet Gaynor?
So I really like it when Gaynor and Charles Farrell are on the screen together. I think that they have a really nice chemistry, and I mean, they just look like they're madly in love with each other whenever they're together. And there's a scene in this that I think is really affecting, in which they're at his place and they're undressing, and he even gets like shirtless, which I don't know if that was like that rare.
Scandalous.
Yeah. But, she's like watching him, and, she really likes what she sees. And it's actually like really, sensual and kind of erotic and, very moving. And I was, really moved by that. I think the problem is that the scenes where these two characters are apart just don't really resonate that much. When he leaves for war, I think the film loses a lot of momentum. And, I like the scenes between Gaynor and her sister, who's played really memorably by Gladys Brockwell. I think that their fights are very memorable, and I wouldn't say they're fun to watch, but they're just very memorable. Just because the Gladys Brockwell like really hams it up and is really violent as her sister.
Yeah. But I do love the moment that she turns the tables on her sister and is just beating her around with the whip.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think Gaynor just has a very warm and enchanting presence in this. I think she's, plenty watchable. And I think she acquits herself, just fine, in the more, showy scenes. When she learns about Charles Farrell's death, I think she acquits herself quite well. And I think the film is really nicely photographed. I love all the Paris production design. I love a lot of the camera shots of just, ascending all of the 7 floors of his place. I do think it's a little long. I think that the war footage probably could have been trimmed a bit. And I don't think the war scenes are very well staged. But yeah, I think that it's a good showcase for Gaynor and Farrell. I think that honestly, it's probably a better showcase for him than it is her to an extent. And I think the film around them looks really marvelous. I just think the proceedings when they're apart aren't nearly as compelling as when they're together. But, I'll always remember it for that scene where he's undressing and she's watching him, just because I think that it's really, really moving and striking for a film, of this era. I think they play it both really well. And I think that Charles Farrell was just a really striking and beautiful man. And it's kind of a surprise to me that he wasn't nominated this year.
Yeah, he's great. I agree. They both should have been. And yeah, I had like my own segment on that particular scene in our Best Picture discussion with the great Eric Anderson. And yeah, it's just very rare to see something like that feels very much like it's from the female gaze.
Yeah.
In this time period. Definitely love that scene. I do think that the final 15 minutes or so are probably the best scenes between the 3 films that she's nominated for. Just because she's asked to do so much. She is just, she's been separated from this man who is her soulmate, and they do have like this spiritual connection, and she knows deep in her heart that even if they've said that he died, there's still something about it. He has to still be out there. There's just a lot that she has to communicate in those moments while still being like the common girl, the unpretentious, unglamorous sort of baby face girl who is not like the Gloria Swanson type who is naturally going to just, react theatrically. So I think she's able to keep all of that in check in those moments.
Yeah, I think she's terrific. And, I also love just some of the quieter moments where, she goes to Farrell's apartment for the first time, and she just looks out his window in the beautiful view, and just the look on her face is such a joyous moment. You can tell, she's never quite seen anything so wondrous before. So, I think she, in the same way that, Louise Dresser was able to convey a lot through her just facial expressions, I think that Gaynor does a really nice job too.
And that's something that's basically required if you want to give a great film performance in the silent era, because you can't communicate with your line delivery. So it all has to be in the face. And she just has this really classic old Hollywood face for me. That's, you could see why she would become such a star and reunite with Charles Farrell 11 times more after this, including Street Angel.
Yes.
Which she was also nominated for and won for. I do think this is a little bit retread feeling in general as a film compared to Seventh Heaven. This time she's playing a woman who is trying to provide for her mother, decides to become a prostitute, but then she meets this painter who is Charles Farrell. They fall in love, they run off together, and once again they're forced to separate, very much a recycling of that plot. But I do like that in this one, I think she gets to show a little more agency, a little more personality maybe than in Seventh Heaven. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think this is the weakest of these three films, but I actually think it's her best performance of the three films. I think that there's a scene in this where she really, really gets to shine. And that's the scene where the police are waiting outside of his apartment. And this is basically going to be potentially her last night with Farrell. They're going to arrest her and take her away. So she just has this final hour with him, this dinner.
Right.
And, there's a lot of suspense in this scene. You don't really know, what she's going to do. Is she going to just turn herself in? Is she going to try to, run away? Is she going to, admit things to Farrell? There's so much going on with her face. Her eyes are full of tears. And ultimately, I think it's kind of an agonizing sequence. It really does sell Gaynor as a great actress. And I think she shines beautifully. And, I think this, like Seventh Heaven, I think it's really beautifully photographed. I think the production design's terrific. Again, I think, Charles Farrell is, a really, telegenic and kind of irresistible leading man. That said, it's definitely, I think the most uneven of the films. I think that once Gaynor turns herself in, I think the film loses a bit of momentum.
Yeah.
And I think the final act where Charles Farrell just kind of comes off like a possessed lunatic when Gaynor's trying to beg him for forgiveness in the street, and really doesn't quite work. I think he's not great in that scene and overplays it too much. And I don't think the ending really rings true. But I think, for that one scene alone, I think, this is a wholeheartedly deserved nomination, and really, really proves Gaynor as, a real talent who could work wonders with a screen. Honestly, thinking of all five of these films, I think that's probably the best acted scene across these. Even if the film is probably the weakest, just ahead of A Ship Comes In.
She does have a real urgency here, and I do see her already growing as an actress, past Seventh Heaven into something very confident, and she's still sort of doing the luminous, expressive face thing that she does in Seventh Heaven, but she is definitely more confident in herself, so, she's not as hunched over and sort of timid. There's just an easiness to her that's very appealing, and just an openness that I think really reflects how she's ready to do what she can for the people she loves. Yeah. So there's a little more complexity here, especially for me towards the beginning, where it feels like she has a little more agency compared to like the very end, where it feels like it sort of devolves into a weirdness. I mean, you already talked about it, but
yeah.
She feels like she has to be a little more submissive and sort of falling back on what she does in Seventh Heaven, but it is a nice alternative to that film in that she just gets to be less of like the saintly type of character, so she gets to show her range, which I'm sure greatly helped her.
I also think that,
a winner.
Seventh Heaven and Sunrise are more so concerned with and interested in the Charles Farrell character, and here I think that Gaynor, is the central focus here. The real lead and, I think gets the most to chew on, even if, the material is a little inferior to the other two. So I think this is a really terrific nomination.
Yeah, just to quickly get to a few reviews for both of them, because it feels like they're sort of a pair in many ways. I did laugh because I did read that Luella Parsons criticized Janet Gaynor before she even saw the film Seventh Heaven, saying that she was too young and too inexperienced, but then when she actually saw the film, she left in tears, basically. So, yeah, I mean, I can understand that as like this young up-and-comer baby star of 1926 coming in and really just delivering something you weren't expecting.
Right. And she had to contend with, a veteran like Gloria Swanson, who had given so many performances and was seen as, a reliable person who was always going to turn in, a great dramatic performance.
Right.
Gaynor was still a relative unknown, and she really had to prove herself. And I think she, more than did so with these.
Another review for Street Angel, just saying that Janet Gaynor's winsome personality is well suited to her role. She has throughout her performance an earnestness coupled with her dainty charm, which creates no end of sympathy for the character. And I think that's definitely something that's running through all three of these performances, is real sympathy and something very heroic that you just want to follow her story, maybe more so than the other two that she's nominated with. But let's get to Sunrise, definitely the most watched of the three films. It's wild because watching these three films for the Best Picture series, which I didn't technically have to watch Street Angel, but I just wanted to, just for completism. But I looked at Sunrise, and I feel like I sort of undervalued her performance in Sunrise on that episode, because I walked away from this rewatch thinking that this is very much on the same level as Seventh Heaven and Street Angel. It's very different feeling, but she is giving so much to a role that could be very thankless, because like she is the wife. She is the original wife.
Right.
She doesn't even get a name. And she's able to really just make you fall in love with her pretty much, at the same pace as how this man, her husband, is learning to fall in love with her again.
Right.
I was really just struck by this performance on this rewatch for whatever reason. Like, I watched it earlier this year and I was not really as into it as much, but watching it again and focusing on what she was doing and what she was bringing to it really sort of illuminated this performance for me.
See, that's so interesting, because I consider this the best of these three films, but I consider it the weakest of her performances in the three. I think that this is another one where I think that, the film is more interested in the Charles Farrell character and more focused on him. For F.W. Murnau, I think that he's perhaps a bit more consumed with the technical elements of this. There's this incredible sequence, this carnival sequence, where the production design is just magnificent, and there's this beautiful tracking shot into the carnival, and the film, just from start to finish, is just masterfully lit. There's shots of Farrell walking through moonlight, and it just looks astonishing. But I don't know if he's really that interested or as interested in these characters. If he is, he's more interested in Charles Farrell. And for me, while I think that Gaynor's quite good in this, I think it is kind of a thankless part. And I think she does what she can with it. But in the end, I don't really see this as really a nomination-worthy performance. It's the kind of performance that, for me, would perhaps be kind of a coattail nomination to a film that's doing so well, in Best Picture and in the technical categories, and just kind of, moseys its way in. But, if I just watched this, I would never think, and if I hadn't seen these other performances, I wouldn't think, wow, this Janet Gaynor is one hell of an actress, because she really doesn't get a scene to really display those talents, I don't think. I actually think that, forget her first name, but I know her last name is Livingston, who portrays the woman
Margaret
Livingston, yes. Who portrays the woman from the city, is actually a lot more compelling than Gaynor in this. I think she's really terrific, and I think that had there been a supporting actress category, that would have been a pretty easy nomination.
Definitely.
As is, I'm really not that impressed with Gaynor in this. I think she's fine, does what she needs to do, but I don't think she leaves as much of an impression as the proceedings around her.
Interesting. Just as a correction, that is not actually Charles Farrell. It is, of course,
George O'Brien.
But that's okay. Basically, the Charles Farrell type.
Yes.
Playing against Janet Gaynor.
Yes.
It's okay.
Honestly, I think back to these three films, and a lot of the scenes are so interchangeable, especially between Seventh Heaven and Street Angel, that, I easily...
That was, But yeah, I do think it's a role that is pretty thankless compared to Street Angel and Seventh Heaven, but it is like the Madonna versus the whore dynamic, which I think we talked about on that episode, where Janet Gaynor is this saintly wife figure compared to Margaret Livingston as this devil woman from the city who is, more corrupt and wants to take the man away from his wife. Very much the temptation. And so Janet Gaynor has to just play it really straight and wholesome in response to that. And I do think she does that pretty well. I think she also does create, as much as she is able to, a little bit of an inner life for her character that probably wasn't on the page, where when she goes to the city with her husband and she's very overwhelmed and just, with her facial expressions, there's a little bit of that naivete and her youth is really able to come across here, but she adapts to the city very well. And there's so many little tiny moments where she's like looking at her husband with that sense of love, but also a little bit of that trepidation because like he did just try to kill her. So she doesn't know if she's fully there yet. But then, when they sort of renew their love at the wedding, they're not like renewing their vows or anything, but it's like this spiritual reawakening for them. She really opens up and she's very full of life and sort of bouncing around and ready to take in all these new experiences. She loves to dance, and she wants to really live it up and have fun. And again, the lighting just really suits her very well, especially in this film, that sort of luminous presence. So I agree. I guess I'm sort of like using the same arguments that you were using for Louise Dresser here, where it feels like there wasn't like a whole lot for her on the page, but she was able to get something out of it. I think she just fulfilled the role as best as she could, which is not a role that's naturally going to be that flashy, especially compared to those other two films, but is still decent enough that I was charmed by her.
Yeah, I'll have to revisit it because I was just so taken with just the look and the feel of the film and just the production design. It's hard not
to be distracted by the technical aspects.
Oh yeah. The cinematography is gorgeous, and I just found myself just kind of, my eyes just went elsewhere and just weren't focused that much on Gaynor. Even though I went into this dead set on focusing on her, I was just so entranced by everything around her and not so much by Gaynor. But I think it's a fine performance. I can't really fault it in any way. I think she does what she needs to, and I think that the film itself is a classic. So plenty watchable, and I wouldn't necessarily nominate her. It's not a performance or a nomination that I'm gonna have a hissy fit about.
Your eyes wandered over to the woman of the city, I suppose.
They indeed did, yes.
Much like the man.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, let's just talk about this Oscar race. We alluded to a few things in that discussion, but Janet Gaynor was our big winner. Just to give context for people, this was not like a Democratic vote that she won this. It was from 5 people, the Central Board of Judges, and they just picked the winner. So Janet Gaynor it was, and she was 22 when she won. Why do we think Janet Gaynor was our big winner? Do we think it's just because she had 3 films, so 3 times the content? Or was there something about her that felt special compared to the other 2?
Well, I think this is such an insider game at this point. It's really, who's going to most pander to Louis B. Mayer in a way, or in Louis B. Mayer's friends. And I think that Janet Gaynor, is willing to do that. She was willing to put herself out there. And I think that folks like Louis B. saw her as somebody who could be molded into, a big star. And I think that, for a lot of these old men, she was, more appealing and less intimidating than somebody like a Gloria Swanson, who was such a strong, force in doing her own thing and making her own films. And, Gloria didn't need, these guys to do what she wanted to do. Janet Gaynor was a fresh face, and she was young. She was very wholesome. And I think these guys really ate that up at this time. So I think this is such inside baseball, and, whoever was able to pander to these guys was going to win, and Janet was going to win that because she, there wasn't actual campaigning at this time, but to the extent that there was, lobbying for yourself, she was certainly putting herself out there more so than Gloria Swanson, who really didn't take this seriously at all. I think she was quoted as saying that, this was like comparing apples with oranges. So that was not the sentiment that was going to be, appealing to Louis B. or the folks who are running the Academy. And then as for, Louise Dresser, I know that she was, I believe, married to a Fox executive at this time. So that may have been a factor behind her nomination. But,
Perhaps.
If you're going to compare her very understated turn, this older woman in a very, understated role, to this young, fresh face, 3 performances all nominated and combined together. I mean, I think the young, fresh face is going to best, the one performance, basically a supporting performance by an older woman in a film that didn't make money. And of course, Seventh Heaven and Sunrise, were both successful. So it's not surprising looking back that Gaynor won. I think that folks at first may think that, Swanson may have, been a threat since Sadie Thompson has held up so much and is considered such a classic, and Swanson was such a veteran at the time and respected. But among the folks who are voting on these things, I think that it was probably Gaynor pretty comfortably.
Yeah, I think they picked Janet Gaynor because she was such a discovery, and I think they wanted to reward someone for a full body of work, someone they assumed was here to stay, playing these really sympathetic roles, and I think they were really looking a bit towards the future. And if you were to compare her to Gloria Swanson, who was very familiar, but wasn't the most popular actress among the industry, at least, not as willing to play the game, as you said. With Louise Dresser, she isn't even really the lead of her film, in my opinion. She's not well known. She wasn't exactly lighting the box office on fire. I do think it was a pretty straightforward decision that they made. That it was probably very unanimous that Janet Gaynor was gonna win this. Like, she had it on lock, basically. So yeah, there's really not a lot of nuance, I think, to why she won, and I do agree with you that it probably wasn't that close. So
yeah, I mean, I know that we've seen, some reporting that Louise Dresser may have been a runner-up, or that she may have been won like an unofficial Oscar for Best Supporting Actress or something like that.
yeah, it's very confusing.
Yeah, but I suspect Gaynor won this pretty comfortably, especially when you consider that, Sunrise wins, the Best Unique and Artistic Picture Oscar, and Seventh Heaven is winning Best Director. I mean, these are films that are showing up in other categories as well, which really isn't the case with The Ship Comes In and Sadie Thompson. So in terms of industry support, for these performances, for these films, it seems like Gaynor in a landslide to me.
Yeah, just the perfect combination,
Yeah.
I think. Let's get to a bunch of questions that we got from Twitter. So you're going to hear a lot of the same names that you've heard on the Best Picture series, but excited to revisit our friends here. This is from Gabe Guarin, who said, "Why do you think the Academy only had 3 nominees this year?"
I don't know, what the thinking was behind that at all, honestly.
Yeah, me neither.
I don't know it. Yeah. They're really just trying to figure their shit out at this point, and they really don't know what the hell they're doing. And Louis B. Mayer is calling all the shots, and perhaps he, just thinks that 3 is enough. Maybe there aren't enough amazing performances to fill out a category of 5. So, they go with 3 in these categories. And then I think as more and more films are produced, and more contenders, and people start to take these things more seriously, then the expansion happens. And then, of course, Best Picture balloons to 10 eventually. So, I think they're just trying to, figure things out at this point. And this feels like kind of a test run, so they're playing with smaller numbers. But, I don't really know why or how they settled on 3 this time around.
Maybe they just felt that it would be less work for them if they, didn't do 5 or 4. Like, this is more manageable.
Perhaps. And the fact that they're, nominating people for multiple performances means that, technically there are 5 nominees in Best Actress because it's Janet Gaynor times 3 plus the 2. And then in Best Actor, you have, 2 performances for 2 of the nominees, then Chaplin. So there's technically 5 in that category.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask Louis B. Mayer's ghost that.
Yes.
I
suppose I can ask our friend Eric Anderson, who, of course, canonically was there.
Yes.
He did ask a question that I did just want to read. He did say, why did Janet put all the hors d'oeuvres in her purse? Everyone at the Roosevelt saw.
Yes, I know that Eric was there.
Yes, he was on the scene, a roving reporter.
Yes.
Let's move on. This is from Fritz and the Oscars. Janet Gaynor and Gloria Swanson were 2 big stars of the silent era, but how did Louise Dresser make it on the shortlist here?
I suspect it may have been her marriage, honestly. I hate to say that, but this was such a small film. Today a Ship Comes In would be like a tiny, like independent film that would be like a shock to go anywhere. Yeah, I know that she, was a New York stage actress for some time, so I don't know if there were any, New Yorkers on the panel who perhaps were familiar with her. It's possible. But I suspect that, it may have been her connection to the Fox executive. And Fox, of course, did really well this year. So they had Sunrise, and I think they had some other productions, Seventh Heaven. So, that could have been a factor for sure. But otherwise, I don't know if she was doing any behind the scenes, Sally Kirkland level campaigning. It's possible. But yeah, it is a pretty random nomination, especially when you consider that folks like, Greta Garbo, were in films this year and easily could have made the cut. But yeah, I still think it's a really inspired nomination. I can't knock it.
Yeah. Feels like going a little off the board of the usual suspects. Yeah.
I like it.
This is from Mark Lamb. Which Sadie is best? Gloria, Joan Crawford, Rita Hayworth, Cher?
I haven't seen the Crawford one. The Rita Hayworth one is terrible. It's dreadful.
Right.
And I can't recall if Cher did that on her show or on like the Carol Burnett show. I've seen like photos of it, but I don't think I've ever seen the footage of it. So, but between Swanson and Hayworth, it's a pretty easy call.
No contest. Yeah. Literally, I haven't seen any of the others, so gotta be Gloria by default for me.
Awesome.
Moving on to Jackson DeStefano. Are you as gaga for Gaynor as the Academy is, or do you think 1 or 2 slots should have gone elsewhere?
I really like Janet Gaynor, and I like her in A Star Is Born as well.
Me too. Yeah.
Again, I wouldn't nominate her for Sunrise, even though I love the film, but I'm totally down for those 2 nominations for Seventh Heaven and Street Angel. I think she's really impressive here.
I say that she deserved them for all 3. I'm going to go there. Yeah. It's a phenomenal body of work.
Yeah.
Any actress would be lucky to get these kinds of juicy roles. You could argue with Sunrise that maybe that's not as juicy, but still an incredible film.
Yeah.
That's some great opportunities she got very early in her career. This is from our friend Cody Derricks. This is more of a command than a question, but he said, rank Gaynor's 3 winning performances from this year with 2 exclamation points. So, what do you think?
I would go Street Angel, Seventh Heaven, Sunrise.
Very good. What's interesting is that I came away with this not as impressed with the performance that I was most impressed with when I first watched these films. Maybe it was just my expectations were different, and I was like, I've seen this, been there, done that.
Yeah.
That weirdly I want to rank Seventh Heaven last. It just feels like least experienced to me, and then Sunrise second, and Street Angel first.
Wow.
Luke Valle said, if Janet Gaynor had only been nominated for one of her films, which one do you think it would have been, and which one do you personally think it should have been?
I think it should have been Street Angel, and I think it probably would have been Seventh Heaven, considering that was the one that really seemed to blow people away.
Yep, don't have anything to add, I agree. This is from Ben Miller. Does Gaynor win if she is just nominated for one film?
I suspect so, because, folks will have seen the other films, and I think they'll have remembered them. So I think it would have been on their minds, and they would have gone for it. I mean, and she also, again, she put herself out there. She campaigned in the way you could campaign back then.
Right.
And Gloria Swanson, I think Gloria Swanson didn't campaign, and Louise Dresser wasn't going to win, so...
Yeah, well, it does sort of, the way we're describing it sounds like she sort of won by default. But I do think she put the work in, and she did earn it for what it's worth. It wasn't like a throwaway win, like, oh, of course, because of weak competition she won. She did a phenomenal job in these three films. So this is from Owen Daly. Do you think the Academy should allow performers to be recognized for multiple roles if they are worthy of it? I'm thinking Chastain in 2011 for her multiple supporting turns, or Glenda Jackson in 1975 for her 3 leading roles.
So I totally support actors being nominated, individual nominations. So if Janet Gaynor got, 3 separate, that's what I would support. But I don't really like this combining of 3 in one. I don't like that at all. For instance, like Madeline Kahn in 1974, I think, for Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. I would have nominated her for both, but not like in the same nomination. I would give her 2 nominations.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And I think if someone has given 2 or maybe even 3 great performances in a given year, I don't think they should necessarily have to be punished for, having them come out in the same year, coincidentally. So in the case of like a Kate Winslet in 2008, I think she obviously would have gotten 2 nominations there for Revolutionary Road and The Reader, I assume, which are 2 films that we talked about. Remember, Andrew? Yes, on our very first episode on 2008.
Yeah.
I know you weren't a fan of either of those. I'm a fan of one of those.
Yes.
But I do think in cases like that, like why does the 6th placer automatically rise up to a nomination? It just doesn't really work for me.
Yeah,
so
it's bullshit. And then there's been so many instances where an actor had 2 nomination worthy turns, and it's a shame.
Yep.
But I think that they should change the rule, and but they probably won't.
Yeah, but I agree it shouldn't be like you only vote for one person with their 3 films, because that's just too much of an unfair advantage, I think.
Yep.
Christian Alec, we already mentioned most of this, but he said, do we know how the 3 nominees thought of these nominations? Did they even care back then? Well, Gloria Swanson didn't care, that's for sure.
Yeah. Although she definitely cared later on for Sunset, because she really campaigned to put herself out there at that point. But the Oscars, of course, by 1950 were so established and huge. Yeah. But again, as we've said, Gaynor put herself out there. She campaigned in the way that you could campaign back then. I can't speak for Dresser, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was some behind-the-scenes things going on there, potentially involving her husband. And then, again, Swanson did nothing.
This is from Zeta Short. If this had been a lineup of 5 nominees, who might have filled out the remaining spots? I will just say up front, there's no possible way of really knowing that. But personally, I would just look to other films that they liked and nominated, such as Wings. So maybe a Clara Bow could have factored in somehow.
Yep.
Maybe looking at The Crowd, Eleanor Boardman.
Yeah, Clara Bow has, a number of films this year. She's also in It, which was a huge film for her and kind of a, defining an iconic term. And she was also in Children of Divorce, which was kind of a heavy drama around that time. So you can almost fathom them doing what they did with Janet Gaynor and nominating her for several of these performances. And then you also have Greta Garbo, who's in a film called Love, and also in The Mysterious Lady, which is a pretty showy role. So it's possible that, she may have been on their minds too. I mean, I think ultimately it's really, who is closest to these guys who are running the show back then. Perhaps Clara Bow just really wasn't that close to them, or maybe they just didn't take her seriously. They viewed her as too much of a sex symbol, which Janet Gaynor definitely wasn't. Garbo would, of course, later receive nominations, but, I suspect Garbo was probably pretty close. If I had to guess, who was, right around the corner, I'd probably say Garbo at this point.
That makes sense, especially wanting more established stars like that. Okay. Glenda Miss Jackson, if you're nasty. Why do you think Clara Bow, the leading actress of the Best Picture winner of the year, Wings, was left out? Sort of went into that a little bit there. I did find a funny quote where she said, "Wings is a man's picture, and I'm just the whipped cream on top of the pie."
See, and I feel like Louis B. Mayer and the powers that be would have hated a comment like that and punished her for it. So I think she was too sexy, and I think they were more into the innocence of Janet Gaynor. And I'm not trying to say that in a negative way about Janet Gaynor, because she's brilliant, but in terms of what these guys were more into, I think they were more into a Gaynor than they were a Bow.
More as a respect thing, yeah. For sure. This is from Matt Mazer. How did Lillian Gish in The Wind factor into this race? I'll just say she didn't, because it wasn't eligible until the next year.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one, so I can't really comment. But Lillian Gish is, of course, brilliant.
And this one last question is from Marcel. What do you think of Renee Falconetti's performance in The Passion of Joan of Arc, which would have been eligible this year? I did fact check this. I don't think it would have been eligible this year, but I also didn't see where it would have been eligible from looking at those reminder lists. So it maybe, as a production that wasn't American, maybe wouldn't have been eligible, but it's an iconic performance.
Yeah, I can't speak to eligibility, but she's incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's one of those performances where even if you look at a frame of it, you know what it is, even if you don't recognize, even the film or the actress, you know what that image is. It's just truly the empathy machine. It's not a film that I've seen in a very long time. I don't know if I've actually seen it in full, but I remember early on with film studies and stuff, that was a very important fundamental film.
And I think it's a more seen film than any of these five.
Yes, that's also true. Yeah.
Even though I know Sunrise has been on, AFI's Top 100 and, but I don't know if folks today really revisit Sunrise.
Well, let's get to our final segment here where we really give our verdict as to who we think was the proper runner-up. You mentioned a little bit earlier that there was some writings that perhaps Louise Dresser was the runner-up. I will just say that looking at Inside Oscar, they sort of described both Louise Dresser and Gloria Swanson as runners-up. So I don't know if there was something lost in translation with, what you potentially read. But what do you think? Do you think actually, though, that Louise Dresser could have been, just in terms of how she maybe played the game a little more than Gloria Swanson?
I mean, it's so hard to know, because I feel like all these voters could have easily just gone to dinner together and just kind of gone over who they wanted to support, and then just voted, en masse. I don't know if there was a secret ballot or anything like that.
But I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, just among, considering the folks who made up this group, my sense is that Swanson probably didn't get a lot of traction among this group. I don't know if Dresser necessarily got, many votes, but if I had to guess, my sense is that Dresser may have edged out Swanson a bit, but with both of them, so far behind Janet Gaynor.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me in our discussion and on paper that does track. It's almost like a fruitless exercise, I think, because we're not even really talking about the Academy of today in terms of votes and tallying and all that stuff. So like you were saying, it was probably just a discussion over dinner, and they didn't even really factor in any kind of vote to begin with.
And I suspect that, Louis B. Mayer was probably pressuring folks to go one way or the other too. It really depends, if they were doing a secret ballot or not, or if this was just kind of like a roll call kind of deal where folks were just saying who they were going to go for. But that's the thing too. I feel like if you loved Dresser so much to nominate her, there must have been somebody who was voting for her for the win.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
When
that
you get
it's that
those
like
little
Sally Kirkland thing.
random.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you like voted for her and you had seen the film and nominated her, there was a good chance that you were probably going to go all the way.
I think that's a very, very key point. The maybe the nomination was truly the hurdle in terms of her having support. Not enough for the win, but
No.
still there has to be some passion there. You're right.
Had Sadie Thompson received like a Best Picture nomination or a Best Director nomination, I might be inclined to rethink that. That perhaps Swanson wasn't second, but the fact that the support wasn't really there for Sadie Thompson itself.
It did get in cinematography.
There is that, so
that's one thing.
Yeah, it's more than A Ship Comes In, but
yeah.
I still give Dresser the edge.
Yeah, I want to say that it's Gloria Swanson just because she is this huge star and she was the most bankable star. But I am sort of leaning towards that it could have been Louise Dresser at the end of the day, just because maybe she had less baggage.
Yeah. If this was like
maybe that factored in.
If this was like 1,000 people voting on this, actors, technical folks, etc., easily Swanson. But because it's this tiny group of old white men, I suspect Dresser.
I'm going to agree with you on that one. All right. Well, now I'm curious, Andrew, who you would vote for if you had the voting power of being on the central board of judges. You were the sixth judge. Yeah. Who would you be stumping for?
I mean, I think the Academy got this right. I think that Janet Gaynor deserved the win. And I think if I were to rank these performances, all five, I think that I would actually rank Gaynor and Street Angel first. Much as I adore Gloria Swanson, I really like Janet Gaynor here, and I would give Gloria, the win in 1950. So, I feel totally comfortable doing that.
I would vote for Gloria Swanson.
Nice.
I would be the one person over in the corner being like, but Gloria Swanson, just look at how she commands the screen. Yeah. She really deserves to be like representative of the first Best Actress win that we have. She's one of our biggest stars. And everyone would be like, oh, but what about this, and this personal thing? And I'm just like, let it be about the performance, not the politics.
Right.
But that would be a fruitless endeavor because I would be smacked by Louis B. Mayer. So.
Yeah, and banished from the industry.
Yes, I would be blacklisted.
Yes.
Yes.
See, I honestly, I thought for sure that I would vote for Gloria Swanson going into this, not having seen Street Angel. So my winner has ultimately changed.
Evolution, growth. Oh. We love to see it. Yeah. And maybe if I revisit these performances somewhere down the road, I'm possessed to watch A Ship Comes In again. Suddenly I'll be like, wow, you know what? Louise Dresser's really just delivering something here that I didn't see before.
I mean,
that's why it's important to revisit performances in films.
As F. Murray Abraham said in 1985, the greatest actress in the English language, Louise Dresser.
Yes,
it was, of course,
that is, of course. Yes. But that would have been very fun quote. Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew. This was great.
Oh, I had such a pleasure. And again, such an honor to join you for this. I think this is going to be an amazing series, and I can't wait for you to watch, these performances. There's so many great obscure ones that I can't wait for you to dig up. Yeah. I think it's going to be such a blast just following you over the years to come.
Thank you. Well, I always love talking to you. You always know your stuff. You always up my game. So tell the people where they could find more from you on the internet.
Sure. I'm at Awards Connect on Twitter. My website is theawardsconnection.com, and I'm over at AwardsWatch. I'll be doing some Emmy coverage for them. Just did a piece on Jean Smart and have some other stuff coming up with them. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Perfect. And thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. That's JACOBSEN, not SON, as some people have thought. And the podcast is at Oscar Runner Up on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe wherever you find podcasts if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes for a small monthly fee. So next week, We'll be talking about the second Academy Awards, where we'll be talking about Ruth Chatterton in Madam X, Betty Compson in The Barker, Jean Eagles in The Letter, Corinne Griffith in The Divine Lady, Bessie Love in The Broadway Melody, and the winner, Mary Pickford in Coquette. Should be a very interesting discussion. So if you're listening now, that is your homework heading into next week. And until next time, I will bid you all adieu.